to hit start talk. No.
Hello and welcome to this Login VSI webinar. We are happy to have you with us. Today we'll be covering AVD performance with Windows 10 and 11. We will explore the results of joint testing conducted by Login VSI and Microsoft, and how the outcomes can positively impact your AVD journey. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items. The webinar and slides will be available on demand. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will take some questions at the end of the session. And don't forget to provide some feedback on your way out. This helps us to improve our content. And I would also like to take a moment to announce our upcoming virtual event, Login VSI Vision, taking place on September 29th. Vision will be about building, delivering, and continuously managing smarter digital workspaces, and how to keep up with the rate of change. For more information on this and to register for the event, please visit vision.brighttalk.live, and we'll also drop a link in the chat. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to our fantastic presenters.
Thanks, Gary, for that
Blair,
introduction.
take it away.
And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We've got some great information to share with you, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So just a little bit more about myself. I'm Blair Parkhill. I am in the Systems Engineering and Strategic Relationships group here at Login VSI. I've been here for just about 7 years. And I've been doing VDI and systems engineering for over 20. So definitely a fun topic to be able to cover this. I'm a digital nomad. I tend to present from all around the world, from different remote locations, and 3 of them that I live in are Colorado, New Mexico, and Costa Rica. Today I'm presenting to you from Colorado, up here in the mountains. So definitely have been spending a lot of time in Azure Virtual Desktop. Back in the day during Windows Virtual Desktop, it definitely was pioneering, it felt like, in a lot of ways, and I've been presenting on that for the last 2 or 3 years. So been really fun. So let me hand it over to my other presenter and good friend Jim.
Thanks, Blair. So my name is Jim Moyle. I'm a senior program manager with Azure Virtual Desktop. I came across to Microsoft a few years ago through the acquisition of the FSLogix technology. You can find me sharing stuff on YouTube, Twitter, and GitHub. And like Blair, I'm a bit of a nomad, but I tend to do it on foot. So I like running stupidly long distances. There's me at the end of an 8-day run up there. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can even find me on Strava.
8 days, man. Wow. So yeah, it's been pretty fun, Jim. Over the last few years, our paths have crossed quite a few times. Actually, our paths and passions and projects have intersected, even as far back as, I think, what was it, Atlantis Computing? You were the first Login VSI customer of ours.
I was, yeah. That's a long time ago.
What a history! And we both presented at the VDI Performance Summit in January of 2020. Which was fun. I think you kind of rounded out the event there, giving your keynote, and that was my first one presenting on WVD at the time. And I think you were also talking about what was it?
Talking about scalability and VM sizing and how that affects load balancing and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
I just stepped off a red-eye flight as well.
I remember that. Man, well, I guess what it boils down to, Jim, is this question. Is it time for Windows 11?
Yeah, absolutely. I reckon if you're attending this webinar, you're probably an IT pro. You're probably very up on remote working, and you may be connecting from a bring your own device. And if it's your personal device, like mine, I bet that it's Windows 11. Now, as IT pros in this industry, right, there's effectively something that happens when you first see Windows or a new version of Windows delivered to your personal environment. That starts a clock ticking in your head, right? It starts a clock ticking that soon I'm going to have to deal with this upgrade in my organization. Now, as we all know, dealing with an upgrade in your organization is a lot more complex than it would be on your home and personal device. And if you're an IT pro running a desktop virtualization environment, well, I think that there's one thing that's absolutely predictable. As sure as eggs is eggs, and as sure as the sun comes up in the morning. And Blair said that he worked from everywhere. This is his view from Costa Rica, which we can all take a moment to be quite annoyed and jealous about, I think. So we all know that it's absolutely predictable. A new version of any software comes out, and you have to say, right, how much more is this going to cost me in terms of resources, in terms of effort? What am I going to have to consider to get this out the door in an efficient, timely, and cost-effective way to all of my users and make both me, my users, and my boss happy? Well, that's what we're here to do, because we've done a great amount of testing around this area, and we're here just to share the results of what we've done. Isn't that right, Blair?
That's right.
Now, we might have seen Windows 11 on our desktop, but what's the advantages for you as an IT pro? Well, there's a couple of highlights picked out here, specifically around Azure Virtual Desktop. Faster and more secure. So one of the things that's been developed from the ground up is to be a zero trust ready OS system. Part of that is secure launch and the trusted platform module. And also from launch, it was always multi-session capable with specialist optimizations built into the OS for Azure Virtual Desktop. Now, despite all those changes inside the OS, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to deploy and learn a whole new set of tools for Windows 11 compared to Windows 10. You can still use MEM. You can still do cloud configuration. Windows Update for Business still works the way it should do, and Autopilot works as well. So it's super easy for you to take your existing management tools, your existing IP, your existing skill set for Windows 10, immediately transfer it to Windows 11 and get the great benefits of Windows 11 in your environment. I've got a few customers that I interact with who are already on Windows 11 for Azure Virtual Desktop, and they're having a great time. They love it.
That's cool, Jim. I think the big question that a lot of folks joining today, as you mentioned earlier, is how is this going to affect my cost? Or how is the performance going to be compared to Windows 10? And the testing that we've done definitely is going to, provide some groundwork and some initial information that's going to help these folks get started. Now, what I'd like to cover is how did we get started? How did we get our information? Because this is something all of you can do for yourselves, and it's strongly encouraged that you do go and kind of find out this information. And I'd like to present a little bit of this information to help you understand it. Truly is pretty easy to do now, and especially in Azure, where building an environment to do your testing in is extremely easy. So what we did was we started with an AVD infrastructure in Azure, and I started with the configuration of my host pool. And that includes configuring your session hosts. As you can see up here, I've got a D16 DSV4. Now, this is a pretty common instance that we've seen our customers use in their production environments. It's been a very popular selection. And what we did with those session hosts was also configure them with FSLogic's profile containers, because I think anybody that's running Azure Virtual Desktop is going to be using FSLogic's to manage a lot of those profiles. Also, the second step that we perform here is just to get the Logon Enterprise Virtual Appliance installed. We've got instructions out there. This is something you should be able to do within about an hour and no more, and have it up and running and ready to perform some of your configurations that will allow you to do testing of your AVD infrastructure. And the last thing that we're going to do after we get that virtual appliance fired up is to deploy some what we call session launchers. These session launchers can be real simple Windows 10 Pro machines. You can get the session launcher software from the virtual appliance, install it on those machines, and they will auto register with the virtual appliance and be ready for service. Now for the testing that we performed here, we use the remote desktop client. In the past, we've only supported the HTML5 RD web client, but we do have some newer and experimental software that allows us to use remote desktop client for Azure Virtual Desktop. The good thing about that is it enables things like media optimizations for at a point when Jim and I might be doing some work around Teams. So this allows us to leverage the full reverse connect transport RDP protocol between those session launchers and the session hosts. Anything to add there, Jim?
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on the sort of VM size and the configuration. For instance, we've got the V4 SKU there. Now, V5s are out now. They are higher performance and lower cost. So why didn't we use the V5? Why do we stick FS Logics in there? Well, we wanted to come to where enterprises and organizations are today, so that this testing is as close to hopefully what you've got in your environment right now, and it's as representative as possible. So this isn't a configuration that we've picked to optimize for Windows 10 or optimize for Windows 11. We've deliberately picked this as the most common or the most representative environment for you, the customer. So that's why we've picked this sort of thing.
Brilliant. Speaking of the session host that we configured, there are, obviously two big differences between the session hosts that we tested, and that's the operating system and the version of that operating system that was installed on each session host. So we started with Windows 10. Now, an important thing to remark on is that we use 21H2 for the version. And you can see it's the Windows 10 Enterprise for virtual desktops. This is the Windows 10 multi-session operating system. And that gives us the ability to do multiple sessions on a single session host, which is great from a cost perspective because a single virtual machine can handle multiple connections and you don't have to provision a single machine for each of your users. Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session has also been highly optimized by the AVD product team and works really well right out of the box. Another thing that I'd like to mention is the images that I chose from the marketplace for both Windows 10 and Windows 11 were Gen 2 images. I did this for Windows 10 because for Windows 11 to use TPM, you need to use Gen 2. So I did the same thing because I wanted an apples to apples comparison for Windows 10. We didn't enable secure launch for these, so we're not going to experience any overhead that may be associated with that. But so this is basically Windows 10 plus Microsoft 365 applications. Windows 11 was the same. It was 21H2 Gen 2, and you can see here Windows 11 Enterprise Multi-Session. One thing I'd like to remark on is that the Enterprise Multi-Session OS in Azure is very unique to Azure. So we don't have a lot of historical information or a lot of experience with multi-session in terms of performance and sizing and all that. So it's even more important to do testing of these environments that you're planning to use for your production builds. So, and we'll cover a little more of that in future slides.
So
Yep, go ahead, Jim.
so these were just straight from the marketplace, right?
That's right.
Right, Blair?
That's right.
So yeah, we haven't run any optimizations on this. We haven't run the optimization tools at all. So these are straight as you can get from the marketplace. So if you have got optimizations which you know are good for your organization, you may get even better results than we've got here.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you can't really optimize what you don't test and what you don't observe. So, if you want to take advantages of any optimizations out there, the best way to do it is to do some of this testing. Now, I just wanted to give you a little preview of how, what kind of users are doing this test. And we call this at Login VSI or Login Enterprise Microsoft 365 Knowledge Worker, or just Knowledge Worker. We've set the standard over the last 10 years or so on what a knowledge worker is defined as. And basically, it's just a virtual user that logs into the multi-session OS in Azure and performs a workflow similar to that most of our human users do in production. And that's to browse the web with Microsoft Edge, check email with Outlook, review a spreadsheet with Excel, write a report with Word, create a presentation with PowerPoint, and the virtual user is going to interact much like you see in the graphic in the bottom right of this slide. It's going to interact with it in a very real human way. It's not, it's got some weights and things like that in there that are going to make this to the session host feel like it's a real user. This whole cycle from browsing the web all the way through doing a slideshow with PowerPoint is about a 20-minute cycle, and it's going to repeat itself over and over again until the test is complete. So as you might imagine, you're going to have one user logging in. It's going to start with its workflow, and as each user logs in thereafter, it will begin its workflow. So at some point, you're going to have your total number of users all doing all of this work against the session host. One important thing to note is that with the Microsoft 365 application as part of the image, and with Windows 10 and 11, you get a Teams install. Teams is installed in a machine-wide type of way, which is optimized. But in our case, our virtual users are not logging into Teams, and therefore we're not going to experience some of the overhead that we get from, interacting Teams. Perhaps there will be some testing like that, and Jim and I have put our heads together on what that might look like in the future too.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most common questions we get asked. It's like, how does Teams affect my sizing and my density? And that was outside the scope of this testing. Having said that, both Login VSI and Microsoft acknowledge that this is information that you, the community, really want to know. So look out for something along that lines in future.
Can't wait for that. It's going to be fun. Okay, just a few testing best practices, and then we'll get into some of the results. So from a test process perspective, I like to start with the baseline. You've got a truck. It's completely empty. It can go as fast as it's going to go. Very responsive and probably lots of fun to drive. In our case, we tested a D16 V4, and we had 32 users log into it without running any application. So they'd log in and they'd just be idle after they log in. So we're going to get some metrics from that session host that tells us what that end user experience is like when it's idle. And that's basically going to give us the best case. What's the best that session host can perform at. And not only does it give us that best case scenario, but it gives us a chance to create our profiles with FS Logics, our profile containers. So that first few runs where we're just doing baselines like this, we're really learning about the potential of that session host. So the objective here is that after you do that baseline, you're going to do some discovery. And to kind of lean on my experience in Costa Rica, it's absolutely common to get behind one of these Toyota Hilux trucks full of bananas going about 20 or 30 kilometers per hour, which is creeping along, lots of cars behind it. But the idea here is to load up your session host. You want to see how slow it's going to go when you saturate it. And we've got some great tooling in Logon Enterprise that will help you to understand, okay, if you really, really saturate it, at what point are you kind of crossing that threshold between a good user experience and a poor user experience? And that's where VSI Max Squared helps. We had with Legacy Login VSI, we had VSI Max. With Login Enterprise, it's even better. We call it VSI Max Squared. Now, what that does is that really helps you to find very easily and automatically the best price performance scenario where you have a good balanced cost, but you're also getting a great user experience. So, and it's also nice to see kind of that comparison between your best case scenario and then what your users are going to experience when it's fully loaded. Gives you a lot of flexibility on how you want to move around in your configuration to capture, the best costs and provide the best experience. Now, FS Logics was also something that was installed and used, as I'd mentioned. A couple of things that we're doing and that we did in our testing was we separated the user groups from Windows 10 to Windows 11. Now, we feel like moving from Windows 10 to Windows 11 with your FSLogix profile containers should be no big deal. And it's highly likely that going back from Windows 11 to Windows 10 is also going to be a pretty good situation. I personally did that in my testing, and I'm happy to respond that, I had a good experience moving my administrator from, a Windows 11 profile container and then kind of going back and testing Windows 10 session hosts and seeing all my data still there, my background's updated, and all of the data that I'm carrying around back and forth to make my tools work. So really helpful, saved me a lot of time. And certainly, Jim, you've got quite a deep experience with FSLogix. Anything else you'd like to comment on from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, this is the traditional thing, right? Upgrading a profile, totally fine. Downgrading, use caution, because that's not something that we particularly test at Microsoft, and not really something we support. So, as Blair said, it may work, but it's not something I'd try and do in production.
Fantastic. Now, we also talked about optimization. Um, we talked to the folks at Microsoft that develop the Windows Virtual Desktop optimization tool. And as you know, with Login VSI, we've tested a lot of different optimizers and really seen the benefits. Now, Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session has had the benefit of having the AVD product team build a lot of those optimizations in. So in the latest testing, we haven't really used the Windows Virtual Desktop optimization tool for Windows 10. But Windows 11 is a little different. And as you can see here, there is support for Windows 11. So while Jim and I didn't use that in any of the testing that we've done, I think it might be interesting just to see what happens. And talking to the folks, who developed this tool, they do believe we could see some benefits. So keep your eyes open for that, even though we didn't use it here. If you'd like to see it, certainly provide feedback, and we'll add that to our list of tests to perform. Now, when you're doing testing, it's essential to collect data about the performance of the system. We do this with two tools in the testing that we're doing. One is Login Enterprise, and then the other is Windows Perfmon as it runs on the session host. With Login Enterprise, I'm usually looking at how many active sessions do I have at any point in time. How is the applications? How are they performing? The Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, all of those. Are they all starting properly? How are logins looking? How long does it take for the user to get logged in and ready to go? And then we have something called the EUX score. The EUX score is a new component in Login Enterprise, and it helps to characterize the responsiveness of the system and what that user experience is really like to that user. Windows Perfmon is also a very essential tool here. Again, we're collecting active sessions so that we can correlate the data between Login Enterprise and Perfmon. We're looking at CPU utilization, memory utilization, disk IOPS, and disk latency on those transactions, as well as user input delay. User input delay is a new metric, relatively new, I'll say, in Perfmon that helps to characterize the responsiveness of the system as well. So as the virtual user is sending commands to the applications, how long is it taking that application to respond to that command? So that's user input delay, and it can really show you when that performance kind of falls off as well. Now, I'd like to say just a little more about the EUX score, because this is one of those things that we want to provide to you to make it easier for you to do tests and collect results, as well as communicate what that end user experience is like to your management. Now, we've been doing a lot of this with real human users in mind. What does it feel like to them? Now, we've been, objectively collecting this type of data and producing results on what that experience is like for over 10 years. So this is something that we're very, capable of doing. It's also something that we have a lot of experience with. But we've done things a little bit different with Login Enterprise. We used not only, our assumptions and a lot of the data and index that to give us some kind of latency score, but instead of doing that with Login Enterprise, we actually used some real humans, humans in HR departments, humans in sales, humans in engineering, even myself. And what we did was we provided a subjective comparison to what we thought that score should be. And our engineers kind of correlated that to what they thought, from an engineering perspective, that score was, which really helped us to temper, how we communicate that and how we score that, so that it really reflects how a real human user feels about the performance that they're getting. And of course, our development team tested thousands and thousands and thousands of different configurations and tests. I've been using the EUX score now for over a year, and it's really given us a good baseline as to how accurate it is, and we feel that it's pretty accurate. Now, looking at this graphic here on the slide, you can see if we're looking at older systems, maybe an older 2015 all-in-one Dell Optiplex, you can see, that score is about a 5.9. And if you look at the grading chart at the bottom, users are going to be kind of happy, but not very. It's going to be kind of laggy. Now, if you look at some newer systems, maybe some 2018 systems, we got a Dell Precision, a 2018 Intel NUC. These were tested using our EUX score and a single user. And you can see the scores there are much healthier at about a 7.5, which we consider to be a pretty good one, right? You've got your little codecs at the bottom and your user's starting to smile a little bit. And then you've got a 2020 Microsoft Surface. Obviously, an 8.1 is a great score. Typically, we don't see scores in the 9s and 10s. That's going to be more like a heavily, compute, outfitted workstation or something like that, right? With GPUs and all that good stuff. So getting into 9s and 10s is pretty hard to get. We have seen some low 9s, but other than that, we do feel that we do have a nice range that's easy to determine. Now on the D16, we hit it with 32 users and we got a score of 6.5. Now, is that ideal? When we did the test, we got a VSI max score of 20, which is telling us, 32 is a little bit too far over the edge in terms of a poor user experience. So how about we look at, something around 20? So what I did was I tried 16. 16 gave me a phenomenal score of a 7.9, which is great. Users with getting a responsiveness like that from AVD are going to be extremely happy, but that's only one user per vCPU, so you're not getting the best cost out of that. So I backed it off to about 24. I got another really good score of 7.5, and I'd say, hey, that's a great balance of cost and performance. So really, I've only done a handful of tests, and I've already identified what is that great mix going to look like for me. Now, with 24 users being the target here, Jim and I decided, okay, let's take this forward. Let's really dig in and analyze this. So, Jim, you want to cover some of the data and let us know how you felt about it?
Yeah, sure. So just on that 24 sessions, bear in mind that this is with the Login VSI knowledge worker workload, right? So I'm not saying that you will get the best bang for your buck on this SKU from Azure with 24 sessions with your um, with your application spread, right? Got to bear in mind that this is a good place to start rather than us giving you prescriptive guidance. Now, how are we doing on memory utilization? We see Windows 10 is averaging 70.9% and Windows 11 81. So there's about a 10% delta between Windows 10 and 11. Along the bottom, we can see the step up as we're logging on the sessions. So we've got that first bit is your logon storm, as it were, and then you've got your second flat line, which is your steady state. Now, obviously, we've got a slight resource increase for Windows 11 here. I'm not too worried about that in terms of memory utilization because in none of the tests we found memory was ever the bottleneck, ever the deciding factor in terms of that end user experience. And that's borne out by years of experience, and we usually see that a multi-session desktop virtualization workload is probably not bottlenecked by memory, but it's probably bottlenecked by other things. So interesting results. Maybe help you with a little bit of sizing, but perhaps not the most telling. Now, this is a telling result. So whereas memory, I don't feel is the bottleneck usually for a multi-session OS, CPU, on the other hand, absolutely is. Now we can see the same session logon as we're building up to the logon storm and then the steady state. In this session, we are opening and closing and using applications constantly. So it's actually probably a harder workload than maybe you would generally find. So this is maybe on the upper level of the resources that you take up. But we've actually got the opposite experience now in terms of CPU and resource utilization. And in the key metric as well, which is CPU. So Windows 11 is actually using 7-8% less resources on average than we see Windows 10 using, which is astonishing, right? You're upgrading your OS, you've got a new version of your OS, and you're using less resources, which probably means that you're going to have a better user experience on the same hardware by upgrading from Windows 10 to 11. Now, let's have a look at the end user experience with those two top lines. So this is essentially, how good you're going to get in steady state and during logon. Almost exactly the same throughout. Slightly better for Windows 11. Again, a great sign. This is the same hardware for both, unoptimized, and we're seeing that Login VSI end user experience score is actually higher for Windows 11 than Windows 10. If we look at the short lines down in the bottom left of the graph, well, that's logon duration, right? And we've done a lot of work with Windows 11 and logon to, even though we've got the additional security built in, we've got the additional user experience and features built in, we're actually managing to reduce your logon time, not by much, but everything counts, right? From Windows 10 to Windows 11. So you can fairly confidently say that your logon speed is not going to increase, and it may even decrease when you're upgrading from Windows 10 to Windows 11, which when I saw that, I was properly astounded. Like, these results are really surprising to me. I know we've done a lot of work, but to move up and upgrade in an OS and take less resources, less logon time is frankly amazing. And the engineers in the back room have done a superb job with Windows 11, I feel.
Yeah, that's actually quite rare. And I think I've only seen that once in the history of testing in virtual desktop infrastructures and things of that nature. Really cool to see the logon stuff too. I think when we did our kind of, when we were trying to figure out which work we wanted to do, logons was really important for us. So how about this one, Jim? I thought this one was super interesting.
So, all right, let me try to explain what's going on here. So how quickly can you log on your users, right? Can you log them on every 30 seconds, every 60 seconds, or every 10 seconds? 10 seconds is red, 30 seconds is yellow, and 60 seconds is green. Why is this important? Well, it's kind of important because when you're thinking about how big to size your VMs, maybe you're thinking, actually, I can do a bigger VM, maybe because I can stand more up more quickly and get capacity online more quickly if I'm doing larger VMs rather than smaller VMs. But that means that you're logging on users more quickly. So I would suggest that we can see here that 10-second login interval for users is perhaps a bit too steep, is a bit too much for what you want to be doing and for what your users want to be experiencing. So that means is when you look at your data for how quickly your users log on, there are countries around the world. So Japan's a good example of this, where the culture for work is that everybody turns up bang at the same time, everybody logs on at exactly the same time, whereas certainly in the UK it's much more of a spread over an hour as there's more flexible working in the culture. So if you are in an environment where you are looking to have a lot of users log on very quickly, this sort of thing is more important because you may want to spread your load over a greater number of VMs and to ease the logon interval for those VMs. We found that actually 10 seconds is bad, but between 30 and 60, not much difference. So if you can get to your logon interval from at 30 seconds or more per user by increasing the number of VMs, or you could even decrease it down to that if you want, but that's kind of what you want to be aiming for in terms of a logon interval in your production environment. So this is kind of why. You remember we talked about CPU being the key metric here, and this is what we're measuring here. And this is the reason why that 10-second logon interval is having issues. We're actually pinning that CPU. So we're hitting that 100%, which is why the end user experience score goes down, which is why that logon interval is perhaps not the best on this particular SKU for this particular workload. So this is why testing is so important, because you can easily tease these crucial bits of data out, and then you can test out different SKUs, you can test out optimizations, and you can see where your end user experience is starting to fall away and where you need to place your sizing and your resources to get the best possible bang for your buck into the user experience versus cost.
Yep. And I think just to reiterate something that Jim alluded to earlier, if you have, just because it's 30 seconds doesn't mean that every user is going to have to wait 30 seconds before the other one, right? So if you had 100 session hosts to support your enterprise, you could basically log in 100 users every 30 seconds. So that's definitely going to be a lot more capable of, being able to handle those logon storms that you will typically experience early in the day or perhaps after lunch.
Absolutely, just an indication you may want to scale out rather than scale up.
Yeah. Now, another test that we found to be very interesting, again, comes from the information that I mentioned earlier, which is a baseline test. Baseline includes performance data, but the virtual users are not using any applications here. So um, this was one that I think was astounding, Jim, and hats off to the AVD product team. I'll let you kind of take this one too.
Yeah, so you remember that slide where we had the banana truck? So this is an empty truck, right? So there's no applications being run here. FS Logics is in the mix. It just as an aside, we didn't see any performance impact really from using FS Logics throughout. It put it in there, as I said before, to be representative, but it didn't seem to make a difference in our testing. But good to know. Now, this really shows you the impact of the applications, because with an empty OS and not running those apps, we can see the difference in terms of what's happening with the CPU and what's going to happen with the end user experience. And we can see Windows 11 is significantly less resource hungry than Windows 10 in this situation. And that difference of sort of 7 or 8% that we see in an empty session with no applications is actually reflected in that CPU graph we showed earlier, where we had the applications and it was still that 7 or 8% CPU difference. And we can see it's not coming from the application load, it's actually coming from optimizations in the underlying OS, proving that the OS is taking less resources for Windows 11 versus Windows 10.
Yep, such a huge improvement. We all know that logon storms can be quite brutal on session hosts. So again, hats off to the AVD product team for bringing that one, and to the the Windows 11 multi-session team for really putting that at work. Now, I hope all of you have really seen some pretty cool and interesting information that's going to help you a lot. Certainly Windows 11 is something we're all kind of anticipating. We're going to be asked at some point in time, is Windows 11 ready for our environment? Is this something we should be putting into production? From a summary perspective, I think, as Jim kind of mentioned, it's better on CPU. That's great. That's like a huge one when it comes to bottlenecks and improving performance. It's better on logins. It's better on security. It's better on user experience. So really across the board, I've not seen, typically in my experience, when you're going from one Windows version to another, you might see a performance hit or kind of a change in user experience. But in this case, Windows 10 was rocking. And basically, Windows 11 has just improved upon that from a user, experience perspective, as well as security and performance. So, fantastic. I really enjoy seeing that. Now, this is also something Jim mentioned, but it's really important to reiterate. Your mileage is going to vary, so you need to test in your own environment. For example, I saw when I tested for 32 users that the user experience was just okay. But for some businesses, that might be enough, and of course that could provide better cost, from a financing perspective. And remember, this is operating costs. This is not capital, where you're buying a bunch of equipment and putting that into service. You're getting this from the cloud. This is charged on a time basis. So it's really important to keep that OpEx down. And if you just need, okay, fine, you could do that with 32 users perhaps. 24 is a good experience, and 16 was great. So if you really want to provide those users an outstanding experience, realize a lot of that high productivity, you may want to start with fewer users per vCPU. Now, also keep in mind that this is only a good place to start. Every environment's going to be different. You're going to add your own bespoke applications, your own line of business applications. Some may be more media intensive. Some may be more, compute intensive. So it's really important to understand how is my environment going to be different than what Blair and Jim presented today. And so you're going to have things like antivirus and some of these other applications. Now, even though we see Windows 11 come out just a little bit better, they do have a similar performance profile. So if you're using Windows 10 today and you're moving to Windows 11, that's actually some good news that you can kind of lean on some of the sizing that you've done on Windows 10. But I highly encourage you to baseline on Windows 10, do an upgrade to Windows 11, and compare just how different they are before you make your decisions on how I'm going to scale that in production. And as I mentioned all along, old sizing guidelines don't apply. If you're looking at bare metal gear in your on-prem environment and you're used to running things like Zen Desktop, RDSH, or Horizon, what we used for sizing guidelines is way different than you're going to see in Azure. It's a different, primarily because it's a different operating system. It's a multi-session, it's a Windows client-based OS, that's been outfitted with multi-session. So it's quite it's quite cool, and it really helps with cost in that perspective. So, Jim, any other notes to mention as we kind of wrap up the data here?
No, I think that's good. So it's really important to note that we can see the data from Azure Virtual Desktop, right? I can run a query and say, what percentage of people are using a server OS versus a client OS in AVD. And it's not universal, but it's close. Almost everybody is running a client OS, which is one of the reasons why we've very much concentrated a client OS performance comparison here, right? Because that's where people are. And we see almost everybody who moves to AVD are changing from their on-premises multi-session server OS to a cloud-based client OS, giving great integration with Intune and all that sort of stuff. So if you're thinking, why don't we do server? That's kind of why.
Yeah, good point. Now, if you're interested in what you've seen here today and you're looking at, how do I get started with this? How can I do some of this testing and learn things about my environment? You can go to loginvsi.com/live demo, and you can request a demo, a one-on-one live demo where we can show you the types of tools that we have and can make available to you. I also gave you a preview, or not a preview, but a look at our new EUX score and our new VSI Max squared. Both are going to make it a lot easier for you to get the information you're looking for very quickly and communicate that information to others in your organization, as well as the knowledge worker. So we've got this new knowledge worker for Login Enterprise that is kind of our new gold standard in terms of the virtual users that we deploy into production and pre-production tests that we're able to accomplish. So that's how you get started with Login VSI. And Jim?
So we got some great resources for you to get started with Azure Virtual Desktop as well. The top link there is the quick start guide, which will help you get up and running as soon as possible, get you testing as soon as possible. Perhaps start your testing with both the Login VSI and the Azure Virtual Desktop through those resources. For a bit of more detailed documentation, there's the general docs link. And if you're new to Azure, if you're looking to move to Azure from an on-premises environment, then there's how to create your free account for Microsoft Azure and start your Azure Virtual Desktop journey.
It's a fast path to fun. The last thing I'd like to cover is what Gary had mentioned during the introduction. Is we are going to have the Login VSI Vision event September 29th. This is kind of an evolution of our former Login VSI VDI Performance Summit. So don't miss that one. You can certainly go to vision.brighttalk.live and get registered. Great speakers, really relevant and super up-to-date information. So definitely want to thank you, but at the same time, I'm going to look at some of the questions to see if we've had any come in. And since Jim and I have a little bit more time here, perhaps we can answer some of those. So, wow, okay, we've got quite a few. And if we don't get enough, have enough time to reply to all of them, we'll figure out a way to get that to you. Let's see.
So I can take that top one, Blair.
Yeah,
About
go for it.
yeah. So so there's a question here. When will remote app be supported with a OneDrive full sync client? So that's a bit of feedback that we've had a lot from multiple customers. So currently, using remote app with a full OneDrive sync client is not supported by Microsoft. There are people who've got some workarounds that they've put into production, but they're just workarounds and they're not an official support statement from us. There are some interesting edge cases that we have to make sure that we cover when we're doing remote app and OneDrive, because as soon as we release this support, then we can tell from the feedback we've got from customers, then a lot of people are going to take up this functionality as soon as it's released. So we've got to make sure it's as bomb proof as possible. I can tell you that we've made some really good inroads, and in fact, we are in private preview with some customers with support for the OneDrive full sync client with remote app. That doesn't mean that we'll go public preview relatively soon. We've got to make sure that the feedback we're getting from customers do not have any adverse effects, because it's a big deal. It does mean though that we're fairly far away down the journey to getting that feature and that functionality out to you. So hopefully we'll be able to get that at least into public preview relatively soon.
Cool. Thanks, Jim. The next question has to do with logon storms and the improvements that were made in Windows 11 and Windows 11 Enterprise multi-session. This person says VMware and Citrix has a feature that will allow them to prepare empty sessions for the next logon. Does Windows 11 multi-session have something like this? I'll take the first shot at answering this. And what I'll say is, when you use Windows 11 multi-session, it's similar to just plain Windows 11. When you log on for the first time, you're going to have to create a profile that's based on that user and that user's preferences and name and all that stuff. When you're using it with FS Logics, you're going to create that profile on that profile container. So each subsequent time that user is going to log on, all of that information is already going to be there. And so you should see kind of an improvement in that logon. So logon storm shouldn't be as heavy. So Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add to that one.
Yeah, so I think this is actually referring to a particular VMware and Citrix feature. I think in Citrix it's called Session Pre-Launch. I don't quite recall the name of it from VMware. And so you're absolutely right. So if you can pre-launch your sessions, you can ameliorate the impact of logon storms in your environment. Now that, as you know, that feature doesn't exist within Azure Virtual Desktop, and that's okay. Right now, both Citrix and VMware are great partners of Microsoft and Azure Virtual Desktop, and they do have value add on top of the underlying Azure Virtual Desktop platform. And we're never going to be in a situation where we're looking at our partners' features and trying to do a copy and paste on their features. If it's something that absolutely needs to be in the underlying platform, then we'll build it. But we're not in the business of trying to we want to innovate and produce new things that we know people need. So if you want Citrix and VMware features, then absolutely they add value, and you can go and buy those features as part of their product set. So I would encourage you to look at our great partners if you want features from them.
Cool. We have one question. Will the session be recorded? Of course, it is being recorded, and you can always hit up Bright Talk platform to watch a replay of this event. The last question that we have here is, why did you choose Windows Multi-Session OS against standard single session OS? This person has a point of view that when you choose multi-session, you're sharing CPU and RAM versus it being somewhat more fenced off if you're doing a single session OS. So Jim, you want to take that one too?
Yeah, sure. So it's a bit hard to parse this question. So if I get it wrong, please forgive me. And but we'll try. We'll try. I'll try and answer it. Um, so the last part of this question looks like it's talking about effectively the noisy neighbor problem, right? How can, if you're on a multi-session OS, how can you stop somebody taking all the resources? Well, both Windows 10 and Windows 11 have got a fair share algorithm as part of it. Now, you can't pin it to say you can only have an eighth of a CPU because that's probably not a good idea, right? You don't want people to not be able to access resources when they're free. But if you do get a session or a person or an application trying to take too many resources in a contended situation, then your noisy neighbor isn't going to be too noisy. We're going to try and clamp down on that session and make sure that they're not stealing resources from somebody else. That is not something that's configurable. That is just built into the base OS, and that is active 100% of the time. Now, the RDS role, there's no such thing really as an RDS role anymore with a client OS. The multi-session OS just comes from the marketplace. You don't sort of enable or disable it. It's already set up for you. And of course, any extra features is going to take a little bit of extra resources when you compare it to a single session OS. But overall, that ability to share resources is going to give you a much better resource consumption per user. And I found that multi-session versus single session, it's about half the cost for multi-session versus single session in terms of resources. So if you don't need elevated permissions, like for instance you don't want to allow users to install their own applications, developers and IT pros would be a good example of people who need those elevated permissions. Then a multi-session OS is going to be by far the most cost-effective solution for you, and making that a stateless or a pooled in AVD terminology environment. I hope I've answered that question. And if I haven't, then let me know. You can hit me up on Twitter or wherever and clarify what you need to know. And then there's a couple of nice statements saying thank you very much for the information. You're very welcome. Hopefully we'll be doing some more of these and sharing some more great information around AVD and maybe even Teams as well, right? So yeah, look out for more in the future.
Yeah, so much gratitude to all of you that joined us today. This is a lot of fun. I've been having a lot of fun with you, Jim, and playing with all this AVD stuff and really geeking out. And I really do look forward to more of that. And yeah, I think the team stuff is going to be extremely interesting. So everybody stay tuned for that. That's going to conclude our webinar for today. Thank you again very much. So delighted to have you join us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.